When was the last time you took a long, extended trip? I realize we have lived through a season when the entire world stopped moving and travel was discouraged or restricted or even forbidden. Much of the travel that happened before COVID 19 has not yet returned to pre pandemic levels. I know many of my former meetings these days do not require me to get into a car and travel to a destination at all, just a simple working camera and microphone. Most of us take a trip for a couple days, not even a week. Even a simple trip of a couple of days and 2 overnights requires packing supplies, clothing, toiletries, comforts, and more. I know for Amanda, Patrick, and I, our Somewhere in Time weekend required us to even pack costumes for it. On any trip, you have to prepare for the anticipated weather and for the anticipated activities and places we're going. You have to book the room, you have to arrange the visit, you have to pay for the fuel, the tickets, the food, etc. It has been consistently noted that Americans are the most unlikely to take the full vacation days that are allotted to them by their employers. And up until the pandemic, we often just accumulated sick time and personal time and were loath to dare take a day away from work. It has been almost a welcomed outcome of the pandemic that we are much more willing to stay at home when we are sick than to work while being sick. Whether this trend of taking care of oneself will continue is an open question, as we tend to return to normal as more time passes and memories of the pandemic fade into recent history. For whatever trip or occasion we face, we pack well, sometimes. Sometimes we are caught unprepared or by error find that we have arrived at our destination to discover that our luggage, our supplies, or some other thing we were hoping would be with us did not arrive with us. But how would we pack if we knew this vacation, this travel would be our absolute final opportunity to travel? What would matter? What would you do and how would you pack? What would be considered unnecessary and left behind? In our scripture reading today, Jesus is on the way to Jerusalem. He's going there. He knows better than his disciples that he is going to die at the end of this journey. The turn of the story happens in chapter 9, verse 51. Jesus set his face to go, as the NRSV has it, to Jerusalem. Now, Luke gives us 40% of his gospel on this travel journey, and 10% on the last week of Jesus' life. From here on out, there is this grim determination with what Jesus teaches and what he does. There is danger ahead, and Jesus knows it. Unlike our travel arrangements, which likely have a route and tickets, etc., Jesus' journey to Jerusalem in Luke is not clearly outlined, that he's just on the way to Jerusalem, with Luke only providing while on the way to Jerusalem. In last week's parable of the prodigal sons, the encounter with Mary and Martha, all of those takes place as part of this journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. through Samaria. There are other stories that we encounter along in these next 10 chapters. The two great commandments, love the Lord your God and love your neighbor, and the much beloved parable of the Good Samaritan. We see mounting tension and anger and displeasure expressed between Jesus and the religious leaders of his time. There are times where Jesus heals on the Sabbath, which consternates the religious leaders even more. And then there's the story of Zacchaeus, the head tax collector in Jericho, which we will discuss much more next Sunday. Determined to go to Jerusalem, we are told along the way, somewhere between Galilee, Samaria, and Jerusalem, that Jesus encounters a group of 10 lepers. This is another unique story of Luke, appearing nowhere else in the New Testament. Lepers in Jesus' day were the ultimate outcasts, not only for their disease, which didn't necessarily have to be leprosy as we know it, with the disfiguring and dropping of limbs and fingers, but just a simple change in one's complexion, a disturbing sign. These were the ultimate outcasts because not only did their disease prohibit them from being around people, but also the ritual impurity laws that prescribed isolating and quarantine. The Old Testament gives us instructions on this in Leviticus 13:45-46. It reads, "Anyone with an infection of skin disease must wear torn clothes, dishevel their hair, cover their upper lip, and shout, 'Unclean! Unclean!' They will be unclean as long as they are infected. They are unclean. They must live alone outside the camp." Most Bibles have notes that tell us that the word for skin disease means a variety of discoloring conditions or blemishes. It would not be out of the range that an acne breakout would compel you to have to leave your house and be unable to return to your family until your breakout had cleared and it was reviewed and approved by a priest that you are truly healed. Some of our confusion with the word for skin disease is because of the Greek translation that we received of the Old Testament, where the word that they substituted for the Hebrew word for skin disease was lepra. And often that meant it was poorly translated as leprosy. How many of us gathered here would need to leave this place and dishevel our hair and wear torn clothes and say, "Unclean, unclean," with a breakout of whiteheads or blackheads or bruises or simply moles? Now, I certainly encourage you that if you have a discoloring mole, that should be investigated by a medical professional. We still have some suspicion about the unusual and unknowns in life, don't we? That which suddenly appears must be from a devious origin and must be contained, isolated from the rest of us, in case it is catching. We certainly have had recent experience in the field of isolating and separating. The number of miles driven in 2020 were reduced substantially by 25% in some cases. And many of the businesses and office buildings sat empty for months at a time as we stopped socializing and gathering in groups as a way to avoid spreading COVID-19. I know many of you have had the misfortune, or simply the odds of being diagnosed with COVID-19 and having to be in 10-day quarantine and isolation from others. Jesus' encounter with the 10 lepers is not his first encounter with lepers, not at all. An earlier one is recorded in Luke chapter 5, verses 12 and 13. In that encounter, Jesus does something remarkable. He touches the one that was suffering from whatever the skin disease was. By touching, you also are as unclean as the unclean skin disease person. Often when we are fearful or anxious, we withdraw our hands and hesitate to hug, embrace, grab, or hold others. The power of touch is a kind of way of extending love, sharing care, and affirming those who often feel abandoned, punished, or isolated from others. Jesus didn't withhold his hands. He reached out with them. We tend to overestimate what is needed in a given situation when just a small gesture is more than adequate to change our outlook and attitude. I remember there was quite a lot of controversy involving whether one could touch AIDS patients in the early days of not knowing the disease. And ground was certainly broken when Princess Diana was filmed embracing an HIV positive patient in Britain. Now, the task of truly bringing healing may be greater than our abilities or capabilities, but we should never underestimate the power of touch to transmit care to those who otherwise are perpetually being avoided or isolated. Being isolated and separated from others through no real fault of our own, we've experienced that, haven't we? Other than circumstances that require such conditions would be absolutely devastating. You would have no idea when your situation would change. The blemish or condition would fade to the point that you could return to your former life and lifestyle. Now, on top of that, add suspicion, skepticism, and just plain prejudice and hatred for not only what you conditionally have, but also who you are historically related to. And in that situation, you are like the Samaritan leper in our story. Not only isolated due to condition, but also by relation. You are unfortunately part of an ongoing family feud that has been going on for nearly 600 years by the time of Jesus' life. This family feud began around the time of the destruction of Jerusalem and Solomon's temple in 587 BC. When most of the Jews that were associated with the political and economic systems and powers of the kingdom of Israel were sent away to Babylon, while those who were thought to not have much power or authority at all were left behind to fend under Babylonian rule. When the exiles returned about 70 years later, there was a conflict between those who returned and those who had stayed the whole time. Each side of the feud thought they were the rightful and authentic spiritual descendants of the ancient Israelites, to the exclusion of the other group. So much suspicion, distrust, anger, skepticism was present and seething in Jesus' day that they actually traveled miles out of the way to avoid any possibility of an encounter with the other group. There were two well-known routes through to Jerusalem from Galilee. One was direct through Samaria, which stands between Galilee and Jerusalem, and the other was through the eastern bank of the Jordan River, miles off course. And most Jews preferred to travel as far as possible from encroaching into Samaria. It would be similar to traveling to Ohio by crossing Lake Michigan from Chicago and traveling all the way through Michigan to completely avoid any association with Indiana. But Jesus chose to go through Samaria as he would probably go through Indiana. And he makes Samaritans, of all people, the hero of his greatest parable, the one who stopped along the journey between Jericho and where was the person traveling from? Jerusalem. Two right people avoided the injured man lying on the side of the road, a priest and a scribe who could best be called an associate pastor. But it was a Samaritan, a despicable Samaritan, who lifted him up onto his beast of burden, treated his wounds, provides for his recuperation, 2 days' worth of costs covered at the end, and promises to pay for any additional expenses upon his return. So shocking was the parable of the Good Samaritan that the religious expert who asked the question, "Who is my neighbor who deserves compassion?" could not even say who was the hero of the story when Jesus asked him. He couldn't even say the word Samaritan, but simply responded, perhaps grumbling, the one who helped him. And in our story today of the healing of the 10 lepers, who's the one who does the extraordinary? The one Samaritan who comes back to give thanks. At the beginning of the story, they're doing exactly what expected. We don't hear them saying unclean, but they are crying out for mercy, much like the tax collector's prayer in the temple, in the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee. But Jesus, unlike probably most of the people that pass through Samaria, if they happen to be Jews going that way, does not try to avoid eye contact, but actually sees them and has compassion for them and pronounced them healed while they are still yelling unclean, and tells them to do what is expected of them, be seen by a priest, to be cleansed, to be officially declared overcome of their skin disease. And all 10 of the lepers follow Jesus' simple instructions. Be seen by the priest who can declare you healed. The healing, we are told, happened along the way, and they responded without Jesus doing any action or any touching at all. They simply obeyed what he commanded. But one of these exceeded mere obedience. He shared gratitude. As children, we were often prompted to say, "Thank you," when something kind or caring was done on our behalf. I notice that as adults, we often limit our gratitude to how exceptional the service was, if it met a certain standard, rather than whether someone helped us at our point of need. And certainly these days, with all kinds of reviews and stars being requested, it's far easier to share our disagreeableness, our displeasure, than to stop and recognize the gift we have been receiving. The other 9 lepers did not do anything wrong. They obeyed the letter of Jesus' instruction, and all were healed. They did the letter, but not the spirit. It's the Samaritan who recognizes the source of his healing and returns to give thanks. When was the last time you genuinely said thank you for something done that eased your life, relieved your fears, and restored your life? When was the last time you said thank you to Jesus, to God? 9 times out of 10, I'm afraid, we probably let it pass without even mumbling it. A grateful heart is often more loving and compassionate to other people. Thankfulness makes us generous. When we expect it or think we deserve it or have rights to such favors and responses, we often never say thanks. Jesus did not heal the lepers to get them to say thank you. He healed all of them. Only one went back to demonstrate his gratitude. Jesus could have been so determined to get to Jerusalem that he never saw these lepers, never shared compassion with them, or waited, as it's implied, for one of them to return. Thankfulness often shows up in unexpected places and from unexpected sources. Neither Jews nor Samaritans thought the other deserved respect, kindness, or compassion. Jesus, though, now focused on his final life-defining trip to death in Jerusalem, still is reaching out to outsiders and outcasts. On our journey in life, as we too travel a similar road, are we noticing the outsiders and the outcasts? Do we have compassion? Because sometimes it's only the outsiders and outcasts who express thankfulness. Whatever you travel and wherever you are going, be sure to pack gratitude along the way. Thanks be to God. Amen.